Hey guys, tonight we're wandering the quiet cobblestone streets of 19th century Paris just before the sun peaks above the slate rooftops. The city is hushed, wrapped in shadows, but if you close your eyes and take a deep breath, there it is. That unmistakable cozy scent, yeast and wood smoke, flour and crust drifting from a nearby bakery like an edible lullaby. You're not in a rush. The world is still asleep, and your boots crunch softly as you meander past shuttered cafes and the occasional snoozing horse cart. A flickering gas lamp sways in the morning breeze, and just around the corner, a faint orange glow pulses behind a bakery window. That's your cue. You step closer. Someone's been up for hours, working in secret. Inside, it's another world. The air is thick with heat and flour, and there's a muffled thump of dough hitting a bench. A man in a flour-dusted apron is wrestling a mountain of dough, his arms rhythmically plunging and folding again and again. He doesn't see you. He's humming, maybe to keep time or maybe to stay awake. You're watching the magic unfold at the edge of dawn, and yes, you're already hungry. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a cozy corner of the world, drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always lovely to know who's out there sharing these late night walks with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck beneath the lintel and step into the bakery proper, your boots leaving ghostly footprints in the thin flour layer on the stone floor. The scent deepens, more complex now. A little tang, a hint of caramelizing crust. You realize this place doesn't sleep, because bread in 19th century France isn't just food, it's culture, it's politics, it's daily survival wrapped in a golden crust. The baker, let's call him Henri, nods absently at you as he continues working. He's kneading with both hands, a rhythm so automatic it's hypnotic. Each loaf he crafts has a name, a shape, a story. There's pain de ménage for the big families, rustic, tough-skinned, the kind you could drop on a floor and it'd win the fight. There's pain mallet, a richer, softer bread with more milk, more care. There's even pain d'égalité, a bizarre experiment from revolutionary times meant to be shared equally, but mostly remembered for tasting like regret. Henry doesn't use a recipe card. He uses instinct dough texture smell sound. He adjusts for the humidity in the air, the heat of the oven, how the flour feels between his fingers. Historians still argue whether most bakers in this era truly measured anything at all, or if it was pure experience. One thing's certain, the process hasn't changed much in hundreds of years, and yet it never feels old. You glance around. The walls are stained with soot, the air heavy with steam, and rows of raw loaves lie proofing under linen cloths like swaddled infants. Henri moves like a dancer even in his exhaustion. He's been awake since midnight, maybe earlier, and he won't sleep until the last roll leaves the oven around noon. You probably won't survive this job. Most people didn't want to. There's something holy about this space, even if the bread is secular. Here people don't just make food, they tend to living matter. Dough is a creature. It breathes, it rests, it grows slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a well-fed cat. Some loaves will take 8, 10, even 12 hours from flour to crust. Others, 2 days, especially if sourdough's involved. Patience is the first ingredient, whether or not it's on the label. You notice a wooden paddle leaning against the stone wall. It's about the length of a canoe oar and twice as ominous. That's how Henri slides loaves into the oven, one by one, carefully, like laying down tired travelers for a long nap. And the oven itself, it's a behemoth. A cavernous belly of stone, still warm from yesterday's fire. Henri fed it hours ago, logs soaked in time and routine. Want a quirky tidbit? In some villages, Communal ovens were still a thing in the early 1800s. Not everyone could afford their own, so people would mark their dough with a unique stamp, sometimes initials, sometimes just a decorative squiggle to identify it after baking. Kind of like ye old bakery locker system. One guy even used a fishbone to scratch his name into the crust. Resourceful. You lean against a barrel of flour, taking it all in. Henri tosses a handful into the air for dramatic effect. Okay, not really, but it looks dramatic, and the dust floats in sunbeams now beginning to peek through the window. You could almost fall asleep right here, if not for the thud of another loaf hitting the bench. That loaf won't be shaped for at least another hour. Right now, it's just a bubbling mass full of gas and potential. And no, that's not just metaphor. Yeast has been having a private party in there, and the gases it releases are what give bread its airy crumb. You try to picture microscopic fungi breaking down sugars while you yawn, and somehow it's charming. The bread that's baking now started yesterday. Maybe the day before. This is a long game. There are no shortcuts. Okay, there are some chemical leaveners, like baking soda we're starting to show up around now, but Henri's not that kind of guy. He prefers the slow dance. Maybe you do too. Outside Paris is waking up. You hear cartwheels clatter on stone, a distant bell, the bleat of a goat with no sense of timing. Someone bangs on the bakery door, early customers. Henri sighs and wipes his hands. It's time to feed the city. But you stay behind, tucked in the warm belly of the shop, watching as loaves emerge golden and blistered from the oven. One batch done. 2 more to go. The scent is intoxicating. It wraps around you like a blanket. You're not just observing history, you're inhaling it, and that's just the beginning. Trust me, things are going to get deliciously complicated from here. The morning has fully unfurled now, and with it, the quiet spell inside the bakery begins to break. You hear the first doorbells of neighboring shops ring open, a sleepy grocer whistling down the street, and the metallic rattle of coins being counted somewhere nearby. But here in the warm cave of flour and crust, your attention is fixed on Henri and the life of a 19th century boulanger. You step closer as Henri begins shaping the next round of dough. Each piece, portioned with care, gets weighed not with a scale, but with practiced palms. He cuts lifts, folds his movements faster now, almost elegant. He barely looks at his hands. This is muscle memory carved by years of repetition. His fingers have measured out thousands of loaves, maybe tens of thousands. You might joke that the man could mold bread in his sleep. But the truth, he never really gets to sleep. This is your first real glimpse of what it means to be a boulanger in this era. It's not glamorous. It's not romantic, unless your idea of romance involves ash in your eyebrows and a clock that runs entirely backward. Baking begins when the world stops, usually around midnight or even earlier, and ends when the rest of the city has only just had their second coffee. Henri yawns, finally noticing you again. He gestures with his chin toward the shelves stacked high with day-old loaves. You try not to take offense. It's the baker's way of saying, if you want a snack, there's the discount bin. Fresh bread is for customers who arrive after sunrise, not mysterious onlookers lurking by flour barrels. You brush your hands along one of the long oval loaves, a pain batard, and wonder how this bakery keeps its rhythm. There are no timers, no buzzers, no color-coded spreadsheets. There's just Henri, his nose, and a sense of time you can't quite explain. When he pauses, it's not to check a clock, it's to smell the dough, to feel its tension, to listen for the quiet pop of fermentation. Yes, bread talks. It whispers. You just have to learn its language. As Henri kneads, he speaks softly, almost absently, as though sharing secrets with the dough and with you at the same time. He tells you about his father also, a baker, and his grandfather before him. A family of night owls by necessity, not choice. You nod, not wanting to interrupt, especially when he begins describing how the bakery itself is passed down like a sacred relic. The wooden counters burnished smooth by 3 generations of elbow grease. The stone oven older than Napoleon. The paddle hand carved by someone's great-uncle. The sourdough starter. Let's just say it has more family history than some people's photo albums. Historians still argue whether the tradition of apprenticeship in baking was stricter in rural towns or in big city Paris. In either case, you didn't just walk in and ask for a job. You trained. You swept floors, fed fires, and fetched sacks of flour the size of small horses. If you were lucky, after a few years, you got to touch dough. Maybe. If you didn't fall asleep on your feet first. And yes, the schedule is brutal. Henri explains it casually, but you can see it in the lines under his eyes. He starts mixing dough before midnight. First fermentation lasts several hours. Then comes folding, shaping, proofing. The first batch enters the oven around 4 a.m., just in time to cool before the morning rush. He might catch a nap around 2 p.m., assuming nothing catches fire. Oh, and remember that rooster Henri swears it waits outside just to mock him. Crows precisely when his first tray goes in. Every day. Without fail. And yet, Henri doesn't complain. There's a quiet pride in his voice, like a man who knows he plays a small but essential part in the city's rhythm. He's not a nobleman, not a scholar, not a painter, but every mouth in the neighborhood relies on his hands. His loaves feed factory workers, clerks, seamstresses, priests. On Sundays, they dress up his bread with butter and jam. On weekdays, they dunk it into cheap wine and pretend it's soup. You move to the back of the room where trays of loaves cool on wire racks. Steam rises in lazy spirals, and the crusts crackle softly as they settle. It's a sound you didn't expect, tiny crisp whispers, as the bread sighs into itself, like the crackle of a fireplace, but edible. Here's a fringe fact. In some parts of France, bakers believed the bread's internal voice revealed whether it had a soul. If the loaf spoke as it cooled those little crackles and pings, it meant it was alive somehow. There's no science to it, of course, but if you listen closely, it's hard not to believe. A young boy scurries in, maybe an apprentice. He's wiping sleep from his eyes, hair still pointing in 8 directions, and he begins sweeping with a kind of resigned acceptance. You try to imagine this as your morning routine. Most people complain about traffic. These people battle dough gremlins before sunrise. You ask Henri how he keeps track of so many types of bread. He shrugs. It's like knowing your children, he says, gesturing to a crusty round with a scarred top. That one always slouches during the second rise, but he's sweet inside. You wonder if he's joking. Outside, the line has started forming. Neighbors shuffle up in slippers wrapped in coats, holding woven baskets and yawning. Some greet Henri by name, others just nod. There's an understanding here he works so they can eat. A loaf of bread is more than a transaction. It's a morning ritual, a warm handoff, a gift from the night. One old woman clutches a cloth bag that's clearly older than you are. She peers through the glass with laser focus, scouting for her favorite. Henri waves at her and slips her 2 warm petits pains before she even asks. It's a small kindness. You'd almost miss it if you weren't looking. And just like that, the day begins. Henri moves faster now, doling out bread, making change, joking with familiar faces. But you can already tell he's counting the hours until the next night when the city sleeps and the dough stirs again. You linger a little longer, caught in the quiet ceremony of it all. This life may be exhausting, yes, but it's also intimate, sacred even. And as you watch Henri dust flour from his hands and begin the next batch, you understand in 19th century France, bread isn't a side dish. It's the center of the world. You're still loitering in the scent-swirled haven of the bakery eyes, half-lidded, when Henri glances at the large paper ledger beside the register. It's not just for tracking sales. It's a record of regulations, rations, and weirdly enough government interference in how crusty a loaf is allowed to be. Yes, welcome to the bureaucratic loaf. Because in 19th century France, bread wasn't just breakfast, it was politics, it was law. And the moment you pulled flour, water, and salt together, you were no longer just a baker. You were part of the state's delicate economic ecosystem. Henri walks you through the rules like a tired tour guide who's told this story 100 times. There were limits on the cost of bread, limits on its size, its weight, even its ingredients. You couldn't just decide to throw in extra butter one day unless you wanted to be fined or worse, accused of economic sabotage. Yes, you read that right. People got arrested over bread. During Napoleon's time, and well into the 1800s, local authorities kept a tight grip on the price of bread, pegging it to the average cost of flour. The intention, they claimed, was to prevent famine and keep working-class families from starving. But in practice, it meant bakers walked a financial tightrope trying to make a living without accidentally committing culinary treason. Henri points to a page in his ledger where he's jotted down recent price fluctuations. Wheat's been moody. The weather's been uncooperative. That means his margins are shrinking. Again. But if he raises his prices, he could face a government inspection or worse, a customer riot. Because when people can't afford bread, they don't just complain, they organize. Historians still argue whether these price controls actually helped or hurt. Some say they kept things stable. Others claim they trapped bakers like Henri in poverty, forcing them to choose between legal compliance and financial ruin. It's a debate still toasted over in academic journals today. Meanwhile, your eyes wander to a small framed document hanging on the wall. It's the official bread pricing decree for the arrondissement, printed, signed, and sealed like a royal edict. Because in a country that once crowned emperors and beheaded kings, bread had become the final throne. Henri notices your gaze and chuckles. "That's my leash," he says. He's only half joking. So what happens when a baker steps out of line? Well, in Paris and other large cities, government inspectors would make surprise visits to weigh loaves on iron scales, making sure they weren't underweight or overpriced. You can almost picture the poor guy measuring baguettes with a ruler like some kind of carbohydrate cup. There were even official regulations around bread classification. Pain ordinaire, the common loaf, was for the masses. Pain de fantaisie, fancy bread, was often sweeter, whiter, and priced higher, but it came with a tax. Naturally, the government had to get its crumb too. Want a fringe fact? In 1856, a Paris baker was fined not for shorting his customers, but for overstuffing a loaf with lard and garlic, technically too luxurious to sell as basic bread. Imagine being too generous with flavor and getting punished for it. That's peak France. But it's not all law and no loaf. There's a sneaky artistry to how bakers got around these rules. For example, they'd sometimes shape loaves differently to reflect slight variations in ingredients, longer for leaner dough, rounder for richer batches. No extra charge, just a visual code for regulars. It was like baking with a wink. Henri shows you his own trick, a little notch on one end of the pain de campagne that indicates he added a splash of milk, not enough to break the rules, but enough to soften the crumb and win hearts. It's still legal, he says, unless you tell someone in uniform. You peer over his shoulder as he wraps a loaf in brown paper and scribbles a price. 4 sous, maybe 5 if it's Sunday, and people are in a good mood. The average laborer earns just enough to afford a loaf a day, maybe 2 for a family, so every gram counts. And if you think modern customers are picky, you should see a French housewife in 1834 who suspects you skimped on her crust. That's why every boulangerie posted its prices right by the door, mandated by law, mind you, and had to be ready to explain any irregularities. Henri once got chewed out by a customer because her bread was too light. Not underweight, just fluffy. The horror. You glance at the price sheet again and notice how the cost of bread fluctuates weekly. It's tied directly to the cost of flour, which is tied to the weather, which is tied to the mood of farmers, which, well, you get the idea. Bread in France is basically the stock market with a golden crust. And because bread was so essential, the law even protected bakers from working too much, or, well, tried to. There were baking guilds and rest laws that theoretically offered a day off. But Henri snorts at that idea. A day off maybe in theory, maybe in the countryside. But in Paris, you close your shop, you lose your customers. It's a gamble few could afford to make. There's also the baking police, as Henri calls them. Not an official title, sadly, but in larger cities, municipal officers would circulate with portable scales and notebooks, spot-checking bakeries for fairness. One man had his entire shop closed for 2 weeks because he sold a batch of bread with too much bran, too healthy apparently. Classic. You ask Henri how he stays sane with all this regulation. He shrugs again, flour sticking to the sweat on his arms. You don't, he says. You just keep baking. Outside, the line has dwindled. A few stragglers poke their heads in grateful to find the shelves not yet bare. Henri hands out the last of the morning loaves, brushing crumbs from the counter like he's brushing off the state. For a moment, you imagine him as a quiet rebel, a man dodging the rules by sheer force of dough, and then the final loaf is sold. Henri slumps against the wall, arms folded. He's got about 3 hours before the next batch begins. You consider asking him if he wants to nap, but instead he just grins and says, "Want to see how we really cheat the law?" You lean in. This story's about to get deliciously subversive. Henri wipes his hands on his apron, then gestures toward a small door tucked behind a curtain near the back of the bakery. It's low, almost hidden, and looks more like the entrance to a broom closet than a portal to scandal. But as you duck through it, the air shifts. It's cooler here. Stone walls, no windows, just shelves lined with earthenware jars, small sacks, and a stack of dark, irregular loaves that look nothing like what you saw out front. This, Henri says, picking up one of the knobbly breads is what we don't list on the menu. You take the loaf, it's heavier than you expect. Dense. A little moist to the touch, and it smells incredible. Earthy, nutty, like a forest in autumn if it had a carb content. This is le pain noir, the infamous black bread. Not illegal, but definitely not standard. These loaves were unofficial, unmeasured, and completely off the books, made from barley, rye, chestnut flour, even potato peels in harder times. They were a whisper passed between baker and customer. And they were everywhere, especially in working-class neighborhoods where stretching ingredients was a necessity. Henri explains that while the government set rules for ordinary bread, there were loopholes. As long as the pain noir wasn't advertised, and as long as it was gifted or traded, not sold, you could fly just low enough under the radar to get away with it. Historians still argue whether this kind of barter baking kept communities alive, or simply made law enforcement more creative. You hold the loaf up to the light, which is a bit pointless because this room is lit by a single oil lamp, but you still feel like an archaeologist holding a relic. Some of these black breads date back centuries in form. Variations of them fed peasants during the 100 Years' War, survived famines, and were revived in the 19th century when wheat prices shot up like a sourdough during final proof. Want a fringe tidbit? In some rural regions, people actually preferred these darker loaves not out of desperation, but taste. They believed whiter bread was bland, snobbish, and bad for digestion. That's right, there were bread hipsters before the word hipster was even baked. You ask Henri if people still buy this sort of thing. Not buy, he corrects with a wink. They donate for other things. He describes the unofficial economy of baked goods, bread traded for eggs, firewood wine, or sometimes just goodwill. One woman brings Henri her husband's pickled onions, another slips him dried lavender from her garden. Everyone gets fed one way or another. The loaf in your hands crumbles a little as you break it open. Inside is a surprising swirl of dried fruit and walnuts sweetened slightly with what Henry says might be leftover apple mash from a neighbor's cider press. No recipe, just instinct. It's the sort of loaf no inspector would bother measuring because it belongs entirely to the people. Out in the main room, the day grows louder. Footsteps on the cobbles, church bells in the distance. But in this cool nook, you're surrounded by the kinds of bread that history books usually skip. And that's the funny thing, for all the fuss about rules and flour rations, the real soul of French baking lives right here in the cracks in the improvisations. Henri sets down another treasure, a small round loaf wrapped in linen. This one's baked with chestnut flour and wild honey. He says it's for an older man down the block who can't chew crusts anymore. So Henri bakes it with a thicker steam burst, making the outer layer softer. You ask if that's common, and he nods. You bake for the person, not just the plate. It makes you wonder how many bakers across France were quietly adjusting their recipes, not for regulation, but for kindness. There's also a particular kind of flatbread Henri pulls from a tin box. It's barely risen, more like a thick cracker, but still chewy in the center. He calls it galette de nuit, a night bread often baked with leftover dough and filled with whatever was lying around. Fruit bacon, dried beans. Think of it as the 19th century version of cleaning out the fridge. Historians have long debated whether such scrap loaves were a form of culinary rebellion or just evidence of thrifty genius. Either way, they reveal something essential. French bakers weren't just artisans, they were adapters, survivors, secret keepers. Henri tells you about another underground favorite, pain de brisure bread made with cracked or broken grains that millers would discard. These bits were coarser, harder to knead, but packed with flavor. And cheap. Bakers could make double the loaves with half the flour if they knew how to work it. One year, Henri says wheat prices climbed so high that even the official pain ordinaire was reduced in weight and flavor. We joked it was pain imaginaire, he mutters, smiling at his own pun. It wasn't far from the truth. That year, he leaned hard on the underground pantry, making loaves with bean flour, dried pumpkin seeds, even crushed roasted chestnuts. It's not illegal, he says again, as long as no one files a complaint. You ask who would file a complaint. He just raises an eyebrow and mutters, "You'd be surprised." Even in bread, there's always someone watching. As he seals up the hidden loaves in cloth, Henri pauses and leans against the shelf. The official bread, he says, that's what keeps the doors open. But these, he taps a loaf gently, these are why people remember your name. And he's right. Because you can imagine it, can't you? The mother who gets a sweetened loaf when sugar is too expensive. The elderly man who can finally bite into a meal again. The child who gets his name shaped in crust on his birthday. This isn't just food, it's quiet resistance, not against a king or a warlord, but against indifference, against forgetting. You follow Henri back into the bakery's main room, blinking at the bright sunlight, now slicing across the flour-dusted floor. You'd think the air would feel heavy with rules, scales, and measurements, but somehow it feels freer, like you've learned a secret handshake. Like the bread in your hand holds a story that no price list could ever print. And as Henri sets out to prep the next batch of legal loaves, you can't help but glance back toward the secret room one last time. It's small, yes, but in there, the bread is brave. You return to the front room as Henri lifts a sack of flour nearly as tall as a child. He hoists it with the grace of someone who's been doing this since before his bones started to complain. The sack lands with a thud beside the wooden prep table, sending a puff of flour into the air like a powdery ghost. Now he says, let's talk about ingredients. Seems simple, right? Flour, water, salt, maybe a little yeast. But in 19th century France, each one of those ingredients came with its own tangled backstory, secret drama, and occasional rodent infestation. If the previous room was a whisper of rebellion, this one is a deep dive into the building blocks of bread and the bizarre history they've carried. First up, flour. It wasn't just flour. It was identity. Region, class, season, all of it could be tasted in the grain. You've probably heard of white flour and whole wheat, but in this century, things were way murkier. There were dozens of classifications: blé noir, blé tendre, stone ground, wind milled, sun-dried, barn-aged, and a few that sound suspiciously like wine descriptors. Most urban bakers like Henri got their flour delivered from nearby countryside mills, and these mills were quirky at best. Some were powered by water wheels that froze up in winter. Others used draft animals, which meant your bread might owe its texture to a particularly stubborn donkey. And yes, rats were a problem. Flour sacks had to be kept sealed tight, and bakers developed a sixth sense for knowing when a batch had been visited. One fringe tip: if the flour smells faintly of urine, it's not the terroir, it's a mouse. That's a fun image to fall asleep to. Henri pulls a scoop of flour from the sack and lets it fall through his fingers. It's soft, pale, but not perfectly white. That kind of purity came later with industrial milling. This stuff has flecks, bits, life. You want it to remember the field, Henri says. Water's next, and while you'd think it'd be simple, just add from the tap right, you're in 1830s Paris. And the tap water is questionable. Most bakers relied on well water, and more than a few insisted on hauling it from specific springs. Some swore that water from Montmartre made better crusts. Others filtered it through charcoal linen, or just blind faith. Bad water ruins everything, Henri mutters, filling a ceramic jug from a cistern. You spot a filter at the spout stuffed with clean straw and charcoal chunks. It's a DIY setup, and it's worked so far. Salt was the next diva in the ingredient list. Highly taxed and jealously controlled by the government until the early 1800s, salt was more valuable than you'd think. In some parts of France, the gabelle salt tax was so hated it sparked riots and smuggling rings. By Henri's time, the tax had technically been repealed, but salt still bore the weight of its past. And not all salt was created equal. Coarse gray sea salt from Brittany, fine dry alpine salt. Some bakers even burned leftover bread to ash and folded the mineral-rich powder back into the dough, a kind of bread reincarnation, if you will. Yeast, though, is where things get spiritual. Before store-bought yeast became available in the late 19th century, bakers had to cultivate their own. Henri points to a small clay pot near the warmest corner of the room. It's alive, bubbling slightly. A swampy smell of overripe fruit and wet grain wafts toward you. That's his levain, a natural sourdough starter that's been fed and cared for like a pet. He scoops a bit out, then whispers, "Don't insult it. It holds grudges." Whether or not you believe in sentient yeast, the fact remains keeping a leaven alive was both science and superstition. Some bakers swore by adding grape skins or old beer to give it a kick. Others insisted on feeding it only in silence. And if your starter died, well, there went your week. Historians still argue whether sourdough starters of the 19th century were more diverse than ours today. Some claim the environmental bacteria made for richer, more complex loaves. Others argue that the methods were inconsistent and led to more failures than we'd like to romanticize. Either way, that starter was a living piece of the bakery, an edible heirloom. Want a weirder fact? In parts of rural France, bakers would pass down levain from mother to daughter as part of their dowry. Imagine inheriting your grandmother's yeast. Here, darling, it's a bubbling jar of microbes. Treasure it. Henri gestures to a row of jars on a high shelf. Inside are powdered herbs, ground seeds, and wait, is that saffron? Turns out sometimes the basic dough was enhanced with little extras. A touch of anise here, a splash of rosewater there. Not for the official loaves, of course. But for the whispered ones, the celebratory bread, the holiday loaves, the ones baked for weddings, births, or to mark the end of Lent, he pulls down a small linen bundle and unwraps it. Inside is dried lavender. Only use a pinch, he says. More than that, and it's like chewing perfume. As he speaks, you realize that each ingredient carries its own invisible story, a political history, a seasonal pattern, a whispered rule. Bread isn't just made, it's negotiated. You think of the government edicts you saw earlier, the hidden loaves in the back room, the improvised filters for well water. Every loaf of bread is basically a small act of civil engineering. Henri begins to mix a fresh batch of dough. His movements are measured, precise. The flour blooms under his touch, the water disappearing into it like ink on paper. Salt follows just enough, then a dollop of the living levain which hisses faintly in response. It's like watching someone cast a spell, a sleepy, yeasty spell. You ask how long it takes to make a single loaf. Henri shrugs. A few hours, a few decades, depends how you measure. He kneads the dough slowly, turning it over with the heel of his palm. The sound it makes is quiet but rhythmic, like waves, like breath. He's not even looking down anymore. His hands just know. The dough rests. So does Henri. You both sit on stools, the oven crackling gently behind you. And in that warm lull you realize something. The ingredients of bread, flour, water, salt, and thyme are basically the ingredients of life. They bind, they rise, they rest, and in the hands of someone like Henri, they become memory. Outside, the bells toll noon. Inside, something is rising. The dough is resting slack and warm in its bowl, like a sleepy cat, and Henri leans back with a soft sigh. Now, he says, eyes glinting. Let me tell you about the ovens. At first you expect a tour of some quaint fire-brick chamber tucked in the back wall, but instead, Henri pushes open a narrow iron door right behind him. Heat spills out in a slow, dry wave, not angry heat, but steady, ancient, and alive. You peer inside to see a flickering, ember-lit cavity deeper than you expected, the curved ceiling blackened by centuries of soot. This isn't just an oven, it's a time machine. Wood-fired bread ovens in 19th century France were marvels of engineering often built into the very architecture of the bakery itself. Some dated back to the 1600s, passed along with the property like a sacred hearth. Henri's, he tells you, is from the Napoleonic era, built when bread was rationed and grain riots were a regular Tuesday. This oven has no dial, no thermometer, no buttons. You don't set it, you listen to it. She tells you when she's ready. Henri says, tapping the side of the metal door. It sounds hollow like a muted drum. The baking process begins long before the bread touches the stone floor. Henri burns split beechwood to heat the interior evenly. Once the flames have danced their fill, the coals are swept out with a long-handled brush, and the radiant heat is what cooks the loaves. It's part timing, part instinct, and part educated guess. Historians still argue whether this method produced better bread or just made for better stories. Some say the irregular heat created inconsistencies in crust and texture. Others believe it imbued the loaves with a rustic character impossible to replicate with modern ovens. Either way, mastering a wood-fired bake was like mastering a musical instrument, years of false starts, charred crusts, and near misses. And as Henri demonstrates, it all starts with reading the fire. He tosses in a fresh log, then steps back, watching the way the flame curls. See how it leans to the right, he asks. Means there's a draft. The flue needs closing a touch. He adjusts a lever above the door, and just like that, the flame straightens its spine. It's a dance. No scratch that it's a conversation. And if you speak the wrong dialect, your bread ends up raw in the middle or crisped into charcoal on the outside. Worse still, if the temperature is too high, the crust hardens too quickly and traps steam, causing the loaf to split like a bad toupee. Some bakers, Henry says, used to test oven readiness, with little tricks tossing a bit of flour on the stone. If it darkened to gold in 5 seconds, you were good to go. Others used flatbread testers, quick bakes that let them sense the heat before sacrificing their prized dough. Then there's the coup de maître, the master's slash. That perfect cut made on top of the dough just before baking. It's not decorative, Henri insists, it's essential. The slash allows the loaf to expand in the oven without exploding at the seams. Think of it as pressure release therapy for the bread. He shows you his blade. It's thin, sharp, and slightly curved. A baker's lame pronounced like lam, not lame. He holds it delicately, like a surgeon about to begin. Too deep, and the loaf collapses. Too shallow, and the crust tears on its own. Just right. And she smiles at you. Of course she means the bread. Henri refers to every loaf in the feminine, which you find oddly charming until he says, some days she's moody, some days she sings. Then it's just dead-on accurate. Henry demonstrates the scoring process. One quick flick of the wrist, and the blade glides through the dough's surface like silk. The cut opens slightly as the gluten relaxes, already preparing for the oven's embrace. Into the oven the loaves go, each one slid carefully with a long wooden peel. The motion is fluid load, adjust close, then wait. There's no timer here. Henri watches the edges of the loaves, listens for tiny cracks, and sniffs the air like a sommelier in a flower-scented dream. The heat in the bakery rises. The walls seem to exhale. You wipe your brow, and Henri chuckles. This is the part everyone hates in summer. But come winter, this room is paradise. And now comes the magic. Within minutes, you smell it. Not just bread, but the bread. Crust, caramelizing sugars, melting starches, morphing into those impossibly cozy molecules that scream home even if you've never baked a day in your life. You sit back and drift for a while. Time slows. The oven murmurs, the fire settles into glowing coals, and a few soft crackles mark the transformation happening inside. There's a fringe tidbit Henry shares. While you wait in some regions, people believed that if a loaf didn't rise properly, it meant a spirit had taken residence in the dough. To fix it, you were supposed to walk around the oven counterclockwise 3 times while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. Mostly nonsense, he says, but some days I try it anyway. When the loaves are done, Henri removes them with the same gentle reverence he gave the ingredients. The crusts sing, yes, sing, with tiny crackling noises as they hit the cooler air. This is called the bread's whisper, a brief, fleeting chorus that only happens in the minutes after baking. Miss it, and it's gone. Each loaf is set on a wooden rack to rest. Not just to cool, bread needs to finish cooking outside the oven. The steam inside redistributes the crumb sets, and the crust sharpens. Cut too early, and it'll gum up. Henri gives a loaf a playful pat. Like people, he says, you rush them, they fall apart. And that's the thing. Every part of this oven ritual, from fire to flour, from peel to patience, is designed not just to feed, but to transform. The oven isn't just a tool, it's a partner, a mentor, and occasionally a vengeful god. You can't help but smile as Henri slices one of the finished loaves in half, revealing a crumb so airy and golden it looks like sunlit coral. He hands you a piece. No butter, no jam, just bread still warm, still whispering. You chew slowly, and for a moment, the world outside this little bakery disappears. You're chewing the last bite of still warm bread, its crust crackling gently between your teeth when Henri turns and mutters, "You think the oven's dramatic? Wait until you meet the guild." He doesn't mean a fantasy tavern band or some secret society of wand-wielding bread magicians, though honestly, it's not that far off. He means the real-life bakers' guilds of 19th century France, Powerful, bureaucratic, steeped in centuries of ritual, and just the tiniest bit terrifying. So welcome to the world of Les Corporations Boulangères, where baking isn't just a job, it's a rite of passage policed with the vigilance of a jealous sibling. In cities like Paris, these guilds ran the show, tracing their lineage back to the Middle Ages. By Henri's time, their iron grip was loosening, but the old echoes still linger. Technically, Henry says, I'm not supposed to bake outside my district. You blink. Outside his district, he nods. The city is carved up. Every baker has a patch. You bake outside your patch and the guild finds you. Do it again and they seize your flour. The guilds controlled almost everything who could become a baker. How many loaves could be sold, even the weight and price of the bread. Want to open your own shop? Get ready to prove your family background, complete a multi-year apprenticeship, and pass an exam that includes everything from oven temperatures to the angle of your kneading elbows. Seriously. Henry, like most respectable bakers of his generation, started young 14 to be precise, working under a master baker who corrected him with gentle insults and occasional airborne ladles. His graduation came after presenting a formal loaf to the guild board, a perfectly baked boule with signature scoring and a crust you could knock on like a door. Historians still argue whether these guilds protected quality or simply stifled innovation. Some say the strict standards created the world's most reliable bread. Others claim it created a boys' club with more gatekeeping than a Renaissance festival. But the rituals? Oh, they were glorious. Henri describes the mise en place ceremony, where apprentices were officially recognized by the guild after years of service. Participants wore flour-dusted aprons tied with blue cords. The ceremonial loaf was paraded through the bakery like a royal baby. There was even a symbolic breaking of the spoon, a gesture that meant the student no longer had to fetch ingredients or scrub pots. Then there were the uniforms. Guild members had to wear specific badges during inspections, often stitched onto their aprons or pinned like medals. These weren't optional, they were mandated by municipal law. You could be fined, even suspended for failing to wear your badge during working hours. Fringe tidbit: in one obscure village near Lyon, the Bakers' Guild also required members to kiss a wooden rolling pin carved with the image of Saint Honoré before baking on feast days. They said it brought luck. Henri chuckles, but I think it was just a way to get everyone to stop swearing for 5 minutes. Saint Honoré, by the way, is the patron saint of bakers. His legend involves a miracle where bread kept appearing endlessly from a sacred oven. Today, his name is immortalized in the Gâteau Saint-Honoré, a dessert so elaborate it looks like someone tried to build a wedding cake and a croquembouche at the same time. But back to the guild. One of the more frustrating elements for independent-minded bakers like Henri was the congé, or enforced rest days. The guild could dictate when bakers were allowed to shut down their ovens, usually Sundays and major feast days. If a baker was caught working during these times, it was considered a violation, and the penalties weren't just financial. In extreme cases, repeat offenders were banned from baking for months. Imagine trying to support your family when your livelihood is chained to a calendar drawn up by powdered wigs 2 generations ago. Of course, Henri smirks. Not everyone followed the rules. He describes the quiet defiance among certain bakers who baked small off-record batches on rest days, usually for local cafes or neighbors with coin to spare. These loaves were slipped out the back door, wrapped in linen, and carried by delivery boys who knew when to duck. Historians love to debate whether this was resistance or just survival, he adds. I say both. Still, not all guild stories are soaked in bureaucracy and powdered flour. Some were downright wholesome. There were annual feasts hosted by the guild where even the apprentices got to loosen their belts and eat like royalty. Spit roasted lamb, mountains of bread, and barrels of table wine. that had definitely not been aged more than a week. One year, Henri says his guild held a baking contest for charity. The prize, a gold-plated lame. The loser had to clean every oven in the district, which, as you now know, is the 19th century equivalent of eternal damnation. Despite the layers of control and ceremonial red tape, the guilds also served as a support network. If a baker fell ill or died, the guild helped fund the funeral and looked after the family until a successor could take over the shop. They were in many ways unions before unions were a thing. Henri takes down a battered wooden box from a high shelf. Inside is a faded certificate edges, curling with age. It's his brevet de maîtrise, a master baker's diploma. Signed in ink so spidery it looks like a nervous spider had a panic attack. There's a wax seal in the corner. He touches it like it's a relic. I still remember the day they handed this to me, he murmurs. Felt like I could bake the sun. You sit with that image for a moment, baking the sun. The ambition, the heat, the golden crust of a dream achieved. He returns the box to the shelf. Of course, the guilds began to weaken not long after that. Laws changed. The revolution scared people off from anything that smelled like aristocracy. By the 1880s, guild power was mostly symbolic. Still, you can feel the lingering traces. In the tools, in the recipes, in the way Henri slices a finished loaf with all the precision of a cathedral architect. The guild may have faded, but its ghost lives on in every perfectly scored top, every weighed batch, every moment a baker leans in to whisper, "Not too much water." She's shy today. Outside, a bell rings. Inside, Henri returns to the dough. The streets outside Henri's bakery are slick with rain, the gray afternoon sky bleeding into the cobblestones like watercolor. You step out, the air cool and tinged with the faint scent of roasting chestnuts from a nearby vendor. It's the kind of damp that sinks into your bones, the opposite of the oven's dry, comforting heat. Henri walks beside you, wiping flour from his hands on a worn linen towel. If you think baking is just about mixing flour and water, he says you're missing the big picture. Bread isn't just food, it's politics. You blink, expecting a joke. But Henri is serious, his gaze steady on the bustling street. In 19th century France, bread was nothing less than a matter of state security. It could inspire riots, topple governments, and change the course of history sometimes before breakfast. You trudge through narrow alleys and wider market squares, passing butcher shops, wine merchants, and cafes crowded with chatter. Henri's voice fades into a soft murmur. As you imagine the scene during the French Revolution, a mob storming the streets, cries of bread, bread echoing like a drumbeat of desperation. Bread shortages were the tinder that ignited revolutionary flames. The famous flour wars weren't just about hunger, they were about fairness, power, and control. When prices soared and mills stopped turning, people didn't just grumble. They marched, smashed carts, and sometimes even attacked bakers themselves. Historians still argue whether the scarcity was a result of bad harvest, hoarding by millers, or political sabotage. Maybe it was all three, tangled in a knot of human greed and natural misfortune. Either way, the stakes were high. Henri points to a faded sign above a shop, Boulangerie de la République. The name dates back to the 1870s, when bakeries became symbols of the new democratic spirit. But even then, the bread question was never just about nutrition, it was about identity. In rural areas, peasants often baked their own bread, but cities relied on professional bakers like Henri. This created a delicate balance. Bakers had to meet demand, keep prices reasonable, and avoid upsetting the delicate social order. Fail at any, and your ovens might be cold forever. One particularly quirky story Henri shares is about the pain a darker, coarser bread made from mixed flours, often seen as food for the poor. During times of scarcity, the government promoted pain bis to stretch wheat supplies, but city dwellers considered it a humiliation, a sign you'd fallen on hard times. In Paris, demand for white bread, soft, airy, pure, was so strong that bakers went to great lengths to please customers, sometimes sneaking in extra white flour despite regulations. This white bread obsession wasn't just taste, it was social status baked into every bite. The social symbolism of bread extended even to the table. Henri explains how upper-class households often reserved bread for last, breaking off small pieces to mop up sauces or to show restraint, while working-class families piled bread in baskets like precious gold. In fact, the phrase manger son pain noir, to eat one's black bread, was a common idiom meaning to endure hardship. Bread carried the weight of daily struggle and survival. But the politics of bread weren't confined to the city. The countryside had its own rhythms. Henri talks about the traditional bread-sharing rituals in villages, where the first loaf from a new harvest was ceremonially blessed and divided among neighbors. One fringe tidbit he shares: some rural communities believed that baking bread with salt, harvested during a full moon, would bring good luck. Moon bread, they called it. No scientific basis, of course, but maybe that's what made the ritual feel sacred. The baker was more than a tradesperson. In many places, he was a community pillar keeper of ancient customs and sometimes a secret political agitator. Remember those guild meetings? They weren't just about flour and ovens. They were where local news spread, alliances formed, and occasionally revolutions brewed. And so you see, the humble loaf is a lens on society, its fears, its hierarchies, its dreams. As you walk back toward the bakery, the smell of fresh bread beckons you home. The political turmoil fades for a moment, replaced by the simple joy of breaking bread. Henri pauses at the door, handing you a wrapped loaf. Take this, a reminder that even in chaos there's comfort. You nod, feeling the weight of history and the warmth of the moment. The oven's glow calls you back inside, where the next batch awaits. Back inside the bakery, the atmosphere shifts from the gritty reality of bread as political tinder to the delicate, almost mystical world of fermentation. Henri gestures to a large wooden barrel tucked in a corner, its surface scarred from decades of use. This, he says with reverence, is where the magic happens. You peer inside and see a bubbling, frothy mixture, an earthy aroma rising, sour and sweet, a scent that feels almost alive. It's levain, the natural sourdough starter, the beating heart of traditional French bread baking. Unlike modern commercial yeast, which is a uniform, predictable ingredient, levain is a wild living culture, a complex ecosystem of yeast and bacteria that feeds on flour and water. Each starter is unique, influenced by the local environment, the air, the water, even the flour's source. Henri explains how bakers nurtured their starters like prized pets, feeding them daily, sometimes for years or even decades. Some starters were said to be centuries old, handed down from one generation to the next, carrying the invisible fingerprints of time. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers believed their starters had personalities. Henri recalls a story about a baker in Provence who swore his starter was grumpy during the winter months, requiring extra flour and a touch of honey to keep it happy. I'm not saying the dough was complaining, he chuckles, but if it could talk, it'd ask for a blanket. The science of sourdough is a delicate balance. The yeast produce carbon dioxide, which creates bubbles and makes the dough rise. Meanwhile, lactic acid bacteria produce acids that give the bread its distinctive tang and improve its shelf life. Historians still argue whether sourdough was the original bread fermentation method in France, or if commercial yeast was introduced earlier than previously thought. Some recent evidence suggests sourdough was the default, with packaged yeast becoming popular only in the late 19th century as industrial baking ramped up. Henri's levain starter is thick and creamy, with tiny bubbles visible just beneath the surface. He feeds it with a precise mix of rye and wheat flour, the ratio changing with the seasons. The rye keeps it lively, he says. Maintaining a starter is a rhythmic, almost meditative practice. Feed, rest, Feed rest a dance between patience and anticipation. Too much feeding dilutes the flavor, too little, and the culture dies. He scoops out a spoonful and drops it into the mixing bowl, where it will be combined with fresh flour, water, and salt to begin the next dough batch. The starter is alive, he repeats. You don't just mix it, you listen to it. You watch as he kneads the dough soft and elastic under his hands, the levain bubbles creating tiny pockets of air. There's a subtle difference compared to yeast doughs. It's slower, gentler, more deliberate. This slow fermentation was key to the bread's flavor and texture. Modern fast-rising yeast produces bread in hours, but Henri's ancestors often let their dough rest overnight or longer. This gave the natural yeasts time to work their magic, creating a crust with complex flavor and a crumb that's chewy without being gummy. A fringe belief Henri shares is that some bakers added wild herbs or even bits of leftover wine sediment to their starters, hoping to enhance flavor or speed fermentation. Mostly superstition, he says, but every once in a while it worked. Maintaining a sourdough starter was not without risk. If neglected or contaminated, it could turn into a foul, acidic mess. This was called spoiled levain and was the bane of bakers everywhere. Henri recalls that some masters kept a backup starter in a separate jar just in case disaster struck. The nurturing of levain is also an intimate connection to place. Some French regions boast unique starters that are said to carry the terroir of their locale, the very essence of their land and climate, expressed in tiny bubbles of fermented flour. As Henri shapes the dough into a round boule, you notice how the starter's influence extends beyond just flavor. It changes the dough's feel, its elasticity, and even how it behaves in the oven. You realize the starter is more than an ingredient. It's a living legacy, a centuries-old partnership between human and microbe, between tradition and innovation. And as the dough rests, you lean back, inhaling the scent of possibility, the promise of a perfect loaf to come. The warm, golden light of the bakery casts long shadows as the dough slowly rises on a wooden table, covered in a linen cloth that looks like it's been through a century's worth of spills and secrets. You settle into a quiet corner, watching Henri prepare the tools that will shape this dough into its final form. The bread's journey from dough to finished loaf is in many ways a dance of timing, skill, and patience. The shaping is more than a simple fold or roll. It's an art form passed down through generations of bakers who knew exactly how to coax life from a sticky mess. Henri's hands move with practiced ease. He folds the dough, tucking edges neatly underneath to create surface tension. This is the secret to a good crust, he says. If you don't build the tension, you get a flat loaf with no personality. He rolls the dough gently, the surface smoothing under his palms like calming a restless child. You notice that every movement is deliberate, almost ritualistic, an unspoken language between baker and bread. Here's a fun detail. Some bakers would use special scoring patterns on the dough's surface, slashes and cuts made with a razor-sharp blade to help control how the loaf expands in the oven. Each pattern was like a signature, a way to mark their work and even send messages to other bakers. One Parisian guild reportedly used different cuts to indicate the day's weather or even the political mood. Historians still debate whether these patterns started as practical necessity or evolved into decorative artistry. Whatever the origin, scoring remains one of the most distinctive marks of French bread. Henri picks up his lame, a thin curved blade held steady like a surgeon's scalpel. With a few swift, confident strokes, he scores the dough, creating the classic leaf pattern on top. The cuts allow the bread to expand without bursting unpredictably, controlling its cry in the oven. He places the shaped dough into a proofing basket lined with a linen cloth dusted in flour. This basket, called a banneton, helps maintain the loaf's shape during its final rise. The flour dusting prevents the dough from sticking, but it also leaves a delicate pattern on the crust once baked. Bannetons come in all shapes and sizes from round to oval and are typically made of rattan or wicker. Some bakers even bragged about the quality of their bannetons, insisting their baskets imparted a unique texture to the crust. You ask Henri if bakers ever personalized their bannetons. He nods, recalling a story from his apprenticeship. One baker carved his initials into the base of his basket to identify it during communal baking days. Protecting your banneton was as important as protecting your starter, Henri says. Proofing the final rise before baking is a critical stage. The dough softens, swells, and prepares to transform. Timing is everything. Underproof it, and the bread will be dense and heavy. Overproof it, and it will collapse like a soufflé in a heat wave. Henri sets a wooden board next to the hearth. The oven, you recall, is a wood-fired beast, its blackened door still radiating residual warmth. He sweeps ashes aside and fetches a metal peel, a flat paddle to slide loaves into the oven's belly. There's a theatrical quality to loading the oven. The baker opens the iron door, revealing the glowing red embers, and swiftly places the dough inside. The heat envelops the loaf instantly. You can almost hear the crust beginning to sing. Fun fact, some 19th century bakers used special ceramic tiles or lava rocks inside their ovens to regulate temperature and absorb moisture, ensuring even baking. The technology was surprisingly advanced, a testament to centuries of experimentation. Henri closes the oven door and wipes sweat from his brow. Now the hardest part, waiting. You watch the clock tick, the minutes stretching like taffy. The smell of baking bread intensifies, a comforting mix of caramelized crust and earthy yeast. Then comes the unmistakable crack, the sound of the crust setting and breaking, a sign the loaf is nearing perfection. As the timer dings, Henri pulls the bread from the oven with the peel. The loaf is golden brown, its surface glossy and crackling. He sets it on a wire rack to cool the steam rising like morning mist. Historians still debate the exact baking times and temperatures used in different regions, largely because of variations in ovens, fuel, and recipes. What remains constant is the reverence bakers had for the process. You take a deep breath, letting the scent of fresh bread fill the room. It's a smell that transcends time and place, warmth, home survival. Henri slices the loaf, revealing a soft, airy crumb with irregular holes, a hallmark of a well-fermented dough. You break off a piece, the crust snapping under your teeth, the crumb springy and flavorful. It's simple, perfect, and utterly satisfying. And just like that, a loaf of bread tells a story that spans centuries of hands and hearts, of science and superstition, of the endless dance between tradition and change. The bakery is quieter now, the afternoon sun dipping lower outside the window, casting a warm glow over the flour-dusted counters. You lean against the workbench, savoring the last crumbs of that perfect loaf, feeling a gentle satisfaction settle over you. But the story of French bread in the 19th century doesn't end at the oven's door. It stretches beyond into the lives of the people who ate it, the bakers, the customers, and the communities intertwined with every loaf. You notice Henri carefully wrapping leftover bread in a cloth. Waste was not an option, he says. Bread was so valuable that every crumb was precious. In fact, some bakers kept old hardened bread just to grind it into crumbs for use in other recipes or to feed livestock. Here's an intriguing tidbit. In some French villages, stale bread was transformed into a dish called pain perdu, literally lost bread, what we now know as French toast. It was a way to honor the bread and avoid waste, turning leftovers into something sweet and comforting. The daily life around bread was a ritual. Many workers bought their bread fresh every morning, sometimes stopping by the bakery multiple times a day. Henri explains that bakeries were often social hubs where news and gossip mingled with flour dust. You imagine the street corner scene, shopkeepers, apprentices, and regular customers chatting while waiting for their turn. The baker's role extended beyond making bread. They were pillars of their neighborhoods, often respected and trusted. Yet not all was rosy. In the 19th century, French society was sharply divided, and bread became a stark symbol of inequality. The poor often ate pain, viz. The coarse, darker bread made with mixed grains, while the wealthy enjoyed fine white bread. Historians still argue whether the class distinction in bread consumption was more about economics or cultural preference. Some say it was simply affordability, while others see it as a deeply ingrained social marker. White bread equated with purity and status. Bakers themselves navigated this delicate social landscape. Henri recalls stories of bakers who quietly supported revolutionary ideas by giving bread to the poor or turning a blind eye during shortages. Others were accused of hoarding flour or inflating prices, making them targets during times of unrest. Interestingly, some bakers used their craft to subtly resist authority. There were rumors that bakers added secret ingredients or adjusted baking times to preserve small quantities of wheat, which they distributed covertly. It was a quiet rebellion kneaded into the dough. The physical structure of bakeries also played a part in this social dance. Many were small family-run shops, with ovens built into the walls, often located in bustling market districts. The layout encouraged interaction and transparency. Customers could watch their bread being made, fostering trust. But in bigger cities, as industrialization progressed, large-scale bakeries began to appear, sometimes replacing traditional shops. This shift sparked debate among bakers and consumers alike. Was industrial bread a threat to quality or a necessary evolution to feed growing populations? Henry's own bakery, with its wood-fired oven and hand-fed starters, represents the artisanal tradition resisting the tide of industrialization. There's something human about this, he says. A loaf made with care tells a story you can taste. You reflect on the sensory richness of the scene, the warmth of the oven, the aroma of freshly baked bread, the lively hum of neighborhood chatter. It's a world where bread is more than sustenance, it's community identity and history all rolled into one. And as you take one last bite, you realize that every loaf carries the echoes of hands that shaped it, fires that baked it, and mouths that have cherished it across centuries. Evening begins to settle outside the bakery, the street lamps flickering to life as a soft breeze stirs the curtains. You watch Henry wipe down his wooden counters, the familiar scent of flour and yeast mingling with the faint smell of burning wood from the oven. As he prepares to close, he shares a less-known but fascinating aspect of 19th century French bread culture, the festivals and rituals that celebrated bread as a sacred element of life. In many French villages, the annual wheat harvest was marked by joyful celebrations where bread took center stage. Bakers would present their finest loaves in communal ceremonies, offering thanks for the bounty of grain and the hard work of farmers. One quirky tradition Henri mentions is the Fête du Pain, the bread festival, where bakers and villagers paraded through town carrying massive bread sculptures shaped like animals, flowers, or even miniature houses. These elaborate creations weren't just artistic displays. They symbolized fertility, prosperity, and communal harmony. Sometimes bakers competed to create the most impressive pain sculpté, a bread carved or shaped with incredible detail. The competition was fierce but good-natured, with judges tasting the bread for flavor as well as craftsmanship. Historians still debate how these festivals evolved, whether they began as pagan harvest rituals adapted by Christian communities or were born from medieval guild celebrations. Regardless, the symbolism of bread as both sustenance and spiritual offering remains clear. Henry recalls that some regions believed bread baked during these festivals had special powers, bringing good luck or warding off illness. He chuckles softly, no guarantees, but it sure made the festival tastier. These rituals also reinforced the social role of the baker as more than a tradesperson. Bakers were community leaders, guardians of tradition, and even in some cases, informal healers. In parts of France, people believed bread blessed by a baker could protect against evil spirits or misfortune. Another fascinating facet is the intersection of bread with religion. Henri points to a small wooden cross above the oven. Bakers often said prayers before baking, he explains, asking for a good rise and a safe fire. Bread was seen as a gift from God, a connection between earth and table. In Catholic France, bread had a sacred role in the Eucharist, reinforcing its deep spiritual significance. The symbolism of bread as life itself permeated everyday life, blurring lines between the sacred and the mundane. On quieter nights, Henri would sit by the fire with an old book of recipes, some dating back centuries, written in fading ink. The recipes weren't just instructions, they were stories, memories, and advice from generations past. One recipe, for instance, called for adding a pinch of ground nettle to the dough during times of illness, a folk remedy believed to boost health. Whether this had any real effect, historians remain skeptical, but the idea that bread could heal is a reminder of how intertwined food and faith once were. You think about how much care and belief went into something as everyday as bread, transforming it from a simple carbohydrate into a symbol of hope, community, and resilience. Henri locks the bakery door and turns off the lights. The glow from the oven long faded, but the warmth lingering in the air. As you step outside, the night is calm, and the stars begin to peek through the velvet sky. The centuries-old aroma of French bread still seems to whisper on the breeze. You carry the taste, the stories, and the soft crackle of crust into your dreams, knowing that tomorrow and tomorrow after the ovens will glow again. The streets outside the bakery grow quieter now, bathed in the soft silver light of the moon. You stroll through a nearby market square, still alive in your mind with the echoes of the day's baking, when Henri's stories remind you that bread's influence stretched beyond the bakeries and kitchen tables, right into the heart of French literature and art. You pause by a weathered bench and imagine Victor Hugo himself wandering these same streets, inspired by the humble baguette and the lives entwined with it. Bread was more than sustenance. It was a symbol loaded with meaning, poverty, and privileged survival and rebellion. You recall that in Les Miserables, bread is almost a character itself. Jean Valjean's theft of a single loaf is a pivotal moment that sets his entire journey in motion, a reminder of bread's power to ignite both desperation and justice. Here's a quirky fact: some 19th century painters would secretly sketch loaves of bread in their studio corners, fascinated by the contrast between the crust's rugged texture and the soft crumb within. Still lifes featuring bread were common, symbolizing home abundance, or sometimes the fragility of life. Historians still debate whether this artistic focus on bread reflects genuine reverence, or is simply an aesthetic choice. Some argue it was a subtle social commentary, a way for artists to depict the struggles and hopes of ordinary people. Henri tells you about a little-known poet who wrote odes to the baker's craft, celebrating the alchemy of flour, water, and fire. These poems were often recited at bakery guild gatherings, blending artistry with pride. Bread also played a role in political cartoons and pamphlets. During revolutionary times, bread was depicted as a precious resource, often personified as a suffering figure or a prize to be fought over. The imagery was powerful, accessible, and emotionally charged. You think about how bread in all its forms threads through the cultural fabric of 19th century France, transcending the kitchen to become a metaphor for the human condition itself. In fact, the simple act of breaking bread together held immense social weight, a ritual of trust, friendship, or reconciliation. The phrase breaking bread wasn't just figurative, It echoed real moments of sharing and connection. You imagine gatherings around rustic wooden tables, the clatter of knives against crust, the soft murmur of conversation, and the unspoken bonds forged over a loaf. As the night deepens, Henri pulls from his shelf a small collection of old prints depicting bakeries, markets, and bustling streets, each image a snapshot of history, frozen in flour dust and sunlight. One engraving shows a crowded Parisian street where bakers shout their daily bread prices, a cacophony that was part commerce, part performance. It's easy to see how bread was woven into the very rhythm of life, its cycles marking days and seasons. You realize that understanding bread's story means stepping into a world where every crumb tells a tale of hope and hardship, of craft and culture, of countless hands shaping something enduring and essential. And with that thought, you tuck the day's memories gently away, ready to dream beneath the quiet hum of the night. The early morning hush creeps in as you return to the bakery, the faint scent of leftover flour and ember still lingering in the air. Henri is already at work again, preparing for the new day, a rhythm as steady and timeless as the rise and fall of the dough. This routine reminds you that 19th century French baking wasn't just about tradition. It was a business shaped by laws, regulations, and the ever-shifting tides of society. One of the most famous regulations was the law of the maximum, introduced during the French Revolution, which set price controls on bread to prevent profiteering. It was an attempt to keep bread affordable for everyone, but enforcing it proved complicated, sparking debates about fairness, quality, and economic freedom. Henri explains that bakers had to navigate this complex landscape carefully. Prices too low could mean ruin. Prices too high risked backlash from hungry customers, or worse, the authorities. Interestingly, some bakers used secret codes to communicate about flour prices or shortages, passing messages under the cover of night to avoid penalties. Historians still debate how much these regulations truly protected the poor, or if they inadvertently fueled black markets and corruption. Baking also depended heavily on the grain supply, which was vulnerable to weather, war, and trade. Poor harvests led to bread shortages and social unrest, famously sparking riots known as the Flour Wars. Henri recalls stories passed down from his grandfather about those turbulent times when mobs gathered in front of bakeries demanding justice and bread, sometimes overturning carts or breaking windows. Yet despite these challenges, the craft persevered. Bakers formed guilds and cooperatives to protect their interests, share resources, and maintain standards. These guilds wielded considerable power, controlling who could bake, how bread was made, and even what shapes were allowed. The regulations extended to the oven's tools and even the ingredients themselves. One quirky guild rule prohibited bakers from selling bread before sunrise, a practice believed to protect the bread's spirit. Breaking this rule could result in fines or exclusion. You imagine the tension between innovation and tradition as bakers balanced their livelihoods with pride, community expectations, and evolving technology. By the late 19th century, the arrival of steam-powered ovens and industrial milling began to reshape the landscape, challenging the artisanal baker's role. Henri's eyes gleam as he speaks of these changes, not with disdain, but with the understanding that progress and preservation often walk a delicate line. You realize that the story of French bread in the 19th century is not only about loaves and ovens, but about people adapting, resisting, and striving to find meaning in every crumb. As the morning sun rises higher, illuminating the streets with golden light, you feel a profound connection to those who woke early, worked hard, and baked bread, not just for survival, but for the love of their craft. The afternoon sun wanes, casting a mellow glow through the bakery's windows. Henri pauses his work, wiping his hands on his apron, as you both reflect on the remarkable journey of French bread through the 19th century. This story has stretched across time, capturing the hands, hearts, and hopes of generations, bakers and eaters alike. As the day slows, you think about the legacy that bread has left behind. From humble grains to golden crusts, from communal ovens to crowded city streets, bread was never just food. It was a symbol of life's simplest yet most essential comforts. You remember Henri's stories of festivals and secret codes, guild rules, and quiet rebellions. These were more than quaint anecdotes. They reveal how deeply bread shaped society, culture, and even politics. In the 19th century, bread's transformation mirrored France itself, a nation wrestling with changed tradition, hardship, and innovation. You take a moment to savor the last bite of Henri's freshly baked loaf, its flavor a perfect blend of earthiness and warmth, a tangible link to the past. Historians still argue about the precise origins of the baguette, the impacts of industrialization, and the nuances of regional baking traditions. But what remains clear is bread's enduring power to connect people across time and place. You imagine the countless hands that have kneaded, shaped, and baked loaves over centuries, each one leaving an invisible fingerprint on the crust. As night approaches, you feel the quiet magic of these moments, the shared human experience woven into every loaf, every crumb. And as you prepare to leave Henri's bakery, you carry with you the gentle reminder that sometimes the simplest things, a piece of bread, the warmth of an oven, the rise and fall of dough, hold the deepest stories. You take a deep breath, the rich aroma of freshly baked bread filling your senses one last time before the world drifts softly into evening. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world softens into shadows, let the warm, golden memories of bread, its warmth, its scent, and its timeless rhythm lull you gently toward rest. Imagine the slow, steady rise of dough, the comforting crackle of crust breaking open, and the tender, yielding crumb inside. These are quiet miracles unfolding again and again, just as your breath ebbs and flows. There's a calmness in knowing that across centuries, people have found comfort in this simple act of baking and sharing bread. It's a thread that ties you to countless others, a soft whisper of connection and care. So breathe in deeply, letting the earthy sweetness fill your lungs, and exhale slowly, releasing any worries that linger. Tonight may you dream of golden ovens glowing softly and quiet bakeries of hands skilled and steady, and of stories kneaded into dough waiting to be shared. Sleep well wrapped in the gentle warmth of history's simplest and most enduring gift.